to welcome Ferrisburgh resident Judy Chaves, who has recently published her book, Secrets of Mount Philo, a guide to the history of Vermont's first state park. And today she will be sharing with us a virtual tour of the mountain. And I'll turn things over to Judy.
Thank you, Chris. So thank you all for coming. I'm just curious, I am just wondering how many of you have been on Mount Philo? Looks like there's one person who hasn't been on Mount Philo. So, all right. So actually, I gave this talk yesterday at UVM. It was sponsored by the Vermont Historical Society, who published the book. And I asked that question. Actually, I asked it the reverse. I said, is there anybody here who hasn't been on Mount Philo? And the one person to raise her hand was the woman from the Vermont Historical Society. So it was a little embarrassing for her, but better her than somebody else in the audience. Okay, so I don't have to explain where it is or all that. Okay, so I am someone who basically uses Mount Philo almost as my own personal gym. I have been hiking Mount Philo fairly regularly for at least 20 years. And for about 8 or 9 of those years, I've been researching its history. And by history, I should say, what I really mean is landscape history, which is basically human influence on the land. So that's the kind of history I'll be talking about, landscape history. And over the first couple of years, it slowly started becoming apparent to me that the history of Mount Philo isn't just really this little history of this little mountain. It's in fact a perfect little microcosm of the landscape history of Vermont and much of the Northeast. So by learning about the landscape history of Mount Philo, you are in effect learning about a lot more. And it touches on some really broad issues of land use, land conservation, things like that. And so it turns out that I am not the only person to have figured this out. Way back in 1910, Sam Bassett, who was then the chair of the UVM Classics Department and who had a house near the base of the mountain and was clearly a fan of Mount Philo, he said this: Mount Philo is worthy of consideration as an object lesson, for it teaches us how man sometimes overlooks, then actually abuses the lavish gifts of nature, and at last, often almost too late, endeavors to atone for his errors. To appreciate this lesson, we must glance at the history of the mountain. So even in 1910, he was aware of the fact that the things that had happened on the mountain and were continuing to happen were very perfect examples, an object lesson for what was going on throughout the state and throughout the region. And the really cool thing about Mount Philo is that it is small, it's very accessible. Welcome, find a chair. And it is full of evidence of this very important history. And the evidence comes in a variety of forms. And so it means that you're learning history not just by reading about it, but by actually touching evidence, looking at evidence. One of the things to keep in mind, in fact, as I show you my slides, is to be aware of the variety of pieces of evidence that I have used. And these different ways of learning about history then enable you to get beyond just a sort of an intellectual understanding of it. It's actually, I think of it as sort of this visceral, gut level understanding of history, which in fact then enables you to actually believe that the past happened. Very often when you just read about something, you understand it up here, but you might as well be reading a fairy tale or a story. Once you actually experience the evidence in different ways, you get it really literally throughout your body, like chill-inducing, those kinds of things that I think are really, really important for really getting history. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is walk you through the history of Mount Philo, and I'm going to show you some of the evidence for that history. I am not going to tell you exactly where on the mountain you can find some of this evidence, because you need to have a reason to buy the guidebook. So you can think of this as a teaser, and then when I'm done, after I answer questions, you'll have an opportunity to buy the guidebook. So, right, okay. One more thing to keep in mind as we go through the history is, this is a wonderful quote from the book Hands on the Land, which is a great landscape history of Vermont by Jan Albers. Landscapes show the accumulation of human decisions made over time. So keep this in mind. Ultimately, what were the human decisions that resulted in Mount Philo being what it is, being forested, being publicly owned, being a park for recreation? What were all the human decisions that led up to that? And again, because Mount Philo stands in as this little microcosm, ultimately, what were the human decisions that resulted in Vermont being the way it is, in the Northeast being the way it is? It's a really cool way to think about landscape history. Okay, so here we go. So there was an archaeological assessment done of the mountain in 1987, and it determined that there were probably no permanent settlements on the mountain prior to European settlement. The indigenous people probably would have used the mountain for hunting and gathering, possibly seasonal encampments, but nothing permanent. The one thing that they probably did do to the mountain to make a sort of a severe result on the landscape was they probably kept, if you're familiar with the sort of that bald spot, the main outlook near the summit, they probably kept that intentionally clear to use as an observation point. So that was probably the one thing that was done possibly thousands of years ago to alter what the native forest was. The first permanent settlement, the first farm, was established at the base of the mountain in 1786 by a John Palmer. And by the mid-1800s, the mountain was surrounded by farms. And the mountain itself, by the mid-1800s, would probably have been pretty much clear of trees. The trees would have come down initially for clearing land, to build, to grow crops, ultimately to use the lumber for other things, firewood, the making of potash, which was necessary for soap and gunpowder, and ultimately, by the mid-1800s, to graze sheep. There was a huge merino sheep farm craze in Vermont, throughout the Northeast, in fact. It was sometimes called sheep fever. And so between 1810 and 1840, sheep farming was at its height in Vermont. By 1840, there were 1.7 million sheep grazing in the state. Okay, so that's one of those numbers that's up here, yeah, right, 1.7 million sheep. And eventually I'll show you some evidence that makes you feel it more on a gut level. Okay, anyway, and about 65% of the state was deforested. All right, and just to put that in perspective, today, almost 75% of Vermont is forested. Okay, so we're talking about severe deforestation in the middle of the 1800s, not just on Mount Philo, but throughout Vermont, throughout the Northeast. Severe deforestation, not just for sheep grazing, but also for extracting the lumber. So there is evidence on the mountain of this time period. This stone wall is on a fairly steep slope, currently covered in trees. You can see a little bit of the road that goes up Mount Philo down there. So it's a bit off the beaten path, and it is one of these places where you can stand. Can we get here we go. So it's one of the places where, when the first time I realized that this stone wall was there in the woods, because it's very easy to ignore it. You just walk on the road, you don't really see it. I stood there, and having read all kinds of things about sheep farming, merino sheep, blah, 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 1.7 million, yeah. And then I stood by that stone wall, and it hit me at a gut level, wow, sheep really grazed here. I needed that stone wall to make me actually believe in those statistics. Another piece of evidence is this magnificent maple tree that is very, very obvious when you're walking up the road. People often just stop and sort of pay homage to this tree. You can see from its wide-spreading branches that once upon a time it grew out in an open pasture. And eventually, we're going to get to a slide from the early 20th century, where I'll show you this tree in its youth growing out in the open. So here's another, again, just think about the different kinds of evidence that you can use. So there was a bit of stone wall, now we have a tree, and then we have a piece of artwork. This is a sketch by Roland Robinson, who owned the property, if you know where the Rokeby Museum is in Ferrisburgh. And he was an artist as well as a writer. And he drew this from, if you know where the Rokeby Museum is, this was through one of the farm buildings. And so today, there's no way you could see from the Rokeby Museum to Mount Philo, but the Robinson property at that time was a merino sheep farm. And you could see all the way to Mount Philo, and Mount Philo itself didn't have a whole lot of trees. This sketch was done in 1871, so a bit beyond the height of the sheep farming craze, but you can still see that there weren't a whole lot of trees. So different pieces of evidence from that time period when Mount Philo would have been pretty much clear of trees. By the end of the Civil War, sheep farming basically tanked. You could no longer really make a good living by raising sheep, and there were many reasons for this. One being the end of the Civil War meant no more wool needed for blankets or uniforms. The internal heating for homes became better, so people didn't have to wear quite as much wool. They were wearing more cotton and linen. The western part of the country was starting to open up because of the trains, and the farms out west were way more productive than the farms in New England. Australia was producing wool, and because of the steamship, the wool coming from Australia was actually cheaper than the wool being produced here. There were also various things going on with England and taxation. So all in all, by the end of the Civil War, sheep farming was no longer a good way of making a living. So farmers in Vermont were either abandoning their farms. This was mostly happening in the upland farms, which were that much more difficult to farm. And those farmers were either moving out west to farm, or they were giving up farming entirely and moving to the cities, where because of increased industrialization, there were a lot of jobs available. The farmers who stuck it out, who stayed in Vermont, turned to dairy farming, cows. So that's late 1800s is when the Vermont dairy farm thing started happening. And the upland farms, now abandoned, were starting to get their tree cover coming back because they were no longer being grazed. But the lowlands in Vermont were still being used as pasture. So you start getting this sort of patchwork of forested lands in the uplands and open lowlands in Vermont. And another way that dairy farmers could make a little extra money was by taking in tourists. This was a time period when, again, increased industrialization in the cities, immigrants coming in, the populations in the cities were getting bigger and bigger, and so wealthy urbanites were trying to escape the hot, crowded city in the summer, and they were heading up north for vacations. And so different regions in the Northeast were advertising themselves in different ways to lure tourists up north. The Adirondacks and the White Mountains were advertising themselves as rugged wilderness. Come in and experience the rugged wilderness. Vermont, because of this little beautiful pastoral patchwork of woods and farms, working farms, Vermont was marketing itself more as a civilized kind of way to experience nature. Come live on a farm, eat healthy food, breathe the fresh air. So the sort of romanticized notion of what life on a farm would be like. And so I recently found a quote from Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, that gives you sort of the other side, the other view of this, the wealthy urbanites heading north for summer vacation. And he said this he was trying to defend his kind of a wild design for Central Park, whereas some of the people on the board wanted it to be more sort of European and formal in style. He said, "It is one great purpose of the park to supply to this is Central Park, to supply to the hundreds of thousands of tired workers who have no opportunity to spend their summers in the country, a specimen of God's handiwork that shall be to them inexpensively what a month or two in the White Mountains or the Adirondacks is at great cost to those in easier circumstances. So when I saw this quote, I went, wow, that's like we've got the wealthy folks heading up north, and then the ones who can't afford it, at least we have St. Olmsted providing Central Park for them. So that was very cool. All right, so within this context, in 1886, Frank and Clara Lewis bought part of a farm at the base of Mount Philo, and they called the property Cold Spring Farm. They took in, they had a dairy farm, but they took in guests who came up from Boston, first guests coming up in 1893, and then by 1896, their tourist trade was so successful, they raised the farmhouse, and they put up in its place the Mount Philo Inn. And if you're familiar with the Mount Philo Inn today, it looks very much the same. There have been additions put on, but this shot taken in 1908, that's pretty much what it looks like today. So they were taking in tourists as well as farming. And you can see here in 1908 that the trees have come back to the top of Mount Philo. Right, so in the summer of 1900, two people came to the inn for the summer who would play major roles in Mount Philo becoming what it is today. And they were Francis and James Humphreys, and I am really sorry I only have a photo of James, and I would love to have a photo of Frances. As you will soon see, she's the real hero of our story. But anyway, we'll have to imagine what she looks like. So they came up to the inn for James's health, and they spent a lot of time on Mount Philo, hiking and enjoying the views, and they fell in love with the place, so much so that they wanted other people, more and more people, to experience the mountain, and they convinced Frank Lewis, the owner of the inn, to build a carriage road from the inn up to the summit. At that time, carriage roads up to the summits of mountains were very, very popular. Mount Mansfield, Snake Mountain, Camel's Hump actually had a road part of the way. And so Frank Lewis thought, this is a good idea. It could be an additional offering to his guests at the inn. And so he started buying land on the mountain, on the summit, on the flank, and the Humphreys, who I suspect had a lot more money than he did, actually purchased the land from him, thus enabling him to have probably some extra cash around in order to build the carriage road. So in the spring of 1901, after all this land, the Charlotte land records are very confusing, but I finally figured them out. And so in the spring of 1901, after all this shuffling around of land, Frank Lewis built the carriage road with a team of horses and 4 other men. And so we had this carriage road starting at the inn and going up to the summit. And we have some wonderful old photos of that original carriage road, complete with carriage. And you can see in this shot, so this was taken about halfway up the mountain. And today's road pretty much follows, the up road at least, follows the route of the original road. So if you can imagine yourself halfway up the mountain, you know that this view does not exist anymore. It's totally grown in by trees. So additional proof that once upon a time, the flanks of Mount Philo were in fact free of trees. Larry, grab a chair. So we have some photographic evidence of the original road. We also have bits and pieces of the original carriage road that were abandoned. As we get further up in the history of the park, I'll be telling you how the state kind of tried to improve the road to make it safer for cars. And in doing that, they abandoned certain stretches of the road. This stretch was abandoned because this was the original entrance to the road. Way at the end there is the inn, the Mount Philo Inn. And because when the mountain became a state park, it was no longer associated with the inn. They created a new entrance. So this is a bit that was abandoned, but is still very much in evidence. This is another stretch of the carriage road that was abandoned. This is up closer to the summit. And there's a photo, an old photo that I figured out why, I have evidence for why this is part of the old carriage road based on this bit of iron railing there. So just fun ways to piece these things together. This is another, this is my conjecture that this is another stretch of abandoned carriage road. This is right up at the summit. And this shows you that to do this kind of treasure hunting, this time of year now when the leaves are coming down, sometimes called stick season, this is the best time of year to do this kind of research. You really see sort of the bare bones of what's going on. Frank Lewis, in addition to building the carriage road, as I was saying before, the whole Vermont way of experiencing nature was very civilized, very comfortable, very safe, and so he supplied resting places along the carriage road for people who weren't going by carriage but were actually walking. And so here we have some benches. This is, these boulders are in a very recognizable place, but you need the guidebook to show you. And in the guidebook, you have these old photos so you can actually stand and compare. And that, again, more chills going up the spine. Woo! There really were benches here, and there really was that early time of Vermont tourism, et cetera, et cetera. He also put up several gazebos, or they called them summer houses. This one, again, in a very recognizable place. This boulder, if you know Mount Philo, you know where that boulder is. And again, you can stand with this photo in hand and like have your mind totally blown. And again, a way of really believing that this early tourism period actually happened. I just love that one. Then there was another gazebo. This is halfway up the mountain. Again, notice the incredible view that happened. That was back then. This is early 20th century. And you'll notice inside this, there is this concrete basin that had been, it was filled with spring water. So you could come and sit. There are benches that line that. You could come and sit and drink water while you enjoy the view. Very, very civilized, very lovely. And there is, in fact, evidence of that. So check out this basin in the center here. And this is what it looks like today, right alongside the carriage road. For years, I had walked past this thing, having no idea what it was. I came up with all kinds of theories. And then I was looking at this photo, and it suddenly hit me what it was. And I raced. I was in my house while I was looking at this photo, grabbed the photo, ran up the mountain, and just stood there, you know. Whoops, not that one. Yeah, and I mean, wow. That was, talk about chills running up and down your spine. So as far as I know, this is the only piece of material evidence on the mountain of any of the gazebos. I think that many of them were destroyed when the state widened and straightened the carriage road. I think that they were probably right at the edge of the original carriage road, and so they probably came down at that point. Frank Lewis also constructed an observation tower right at the very summit of the mountain, which is not where that bald spot is, but it's at a different location that I will let you find for yourselves. And the money for this was provided by James Humphrey's sister and brother, who also came up and summered at the inn. And we have a lovely shot here of, check out that hat. Early 20th century visitor enjoying the view from the observation tower. Again, to provide safety, you shouldn't fall off these cliffs. Frank Lewis constructed these old iron railings. Today, the iron railings that are there now are actually they're a replica of the original, and they used some of these old photos to design that. And we have our friend again up. I'm sure you've all stood at this very spot. Yeah. You didn't wear a hat, perhaps, but maybe we have to bring the hats back. I keep threatening to do reenactments of these things. So, but again, you see this, and you have stood there yourself, and you're looking at a view that hasn't changed all that much over the past 100 years or so. So again, it's a way of fully experiencing the past, really believing that it happened. More iron railings. This is the outlook that is if you're up at that bare spot and you sort of head back down through the woods. And you'll notice that there's a sign here. It says Western View. So the Humphreys, James and Frances Humphreys, took great delight in naming a lot of the places on the mountain and putting up signs. Again, another way of making it sort of a humanized landscape here in Vermont. And so Frances Humphreys took these names, and she was a bit of a poet, and she wrote a poem called Mount Philo Picnic that makes use of all of these place names on the mountain and basically outlines an early 20th century hike up the mountain. And that's in the guidebook with a little map that I figured out of the route of that hike. It's different from what we normally do today. So there were all these place names and signs that the Humphreys, I think they took a lot of pleasure in doing that. More iron railings. These are original ones. You can still find them. This is a viewpoint that Frank Lewis established. This is on the original Carriage Road that has been long abandoned, but very, very easily accessible by foot if you know where to go. And I just love these iron railings. And again, one of those times you can stand there, put your hand on the iron railing, and commune with James and Frances Humphreys and know what they were feeling. There were footpaths on the mountain long before the Carriage Road was built, but I think what Frank Lewis did was, I think the Humphreys named them. They named this one the Base of Cliff Path. Today it's called the Devil's Chair Trail because it ultimately leads to this rock formation called the Devil's Chair. But you can walk on this path today, and it really has not changed. And so again, another chance to kind of understand, get in the skin of people 100 years ago. And this one is a little hard to see. So there's this, they call it Old Man's Face. There's a profile of a person there. And you can, in fact, find this on that Base of Cliff Trail today. This is one of the, I have these little sort of treasure hunts in the guidebook. I don't tell you everything, you have to find it, because part of that chill up the spines thing, really getting it, is doing some of the discovery on your own. And I kind of want people to experience what I experienced. When I found this, I just about went nuts. Fortunately, I was by myself, nobody had to see me, but it's just really cool. You feel like you're like, I don't know, you're discovering a new pyramid or something. It's just very cool. So as I said, people were hiking. There were hiking trails on Mount Philo long before the Carriage Road. There are records of people hiking up to the summit during the Revolutionary War, during the War of 1812, to stand on the summit and try to tell from the comings and goings of ships on the lake what was going on further north during some of the battles. There's also a record of people ascending the mountain in the 1840s. In the early 1840s, there was a Vermonter, William Miller, who predicted a number of times the second coming of Christ, and that Mount Philo was one of the places where you could go and experience the rapture, I suppose. And so there was a group that ascended Mount Philo for this purpose in the early 1840s. So lots of people were hiking, but I think Frank Lewis kind of spiffed up the trails and the Humphreys named everything. So again, Mount Philo standing in as a little miniature version of what was going on throughout the state. I'm going to show you just a few pages from a brochure advertising the inn, because this is a classic example of how Vermont was being marketed at that time, early 20th century. So where shall I spend the summer? People were coming for long periods of time, none of this 1 week or 2 week business. And on the Rutland Railroad, easily accessible by people living in the cities. You could be met at the station by a carriage, or you could even take a steamer up Lake Champlain, be met at Thompson's Point, where there was a dock, and be taken to the inn. So here you can see, again, the Mount Philo Inn looks very much the same. It offers to the lovers of nature a delightful retreat from the heat and turmoil of the city. So that was their market. People wanting to get away from the city in the summer. And here we have the Mountain Road being advertised as one of the inn's offerings. And again, the Humphreys owned the land, but Frank Lewis had been given permission to build it, and now he was using it as one of his amenities. The mountain road threading its way through open fields and woods, that patchwork woods and open fields that Vermont was becoming known for. It affords a variety and intensity of scenic beauty seldom equaled in New England. Those of us who love Mount Philo will not argue with this. So classic tourism marketing for Vermont in that time period. So here we have early 20th century. We've got the top of Mount Philo regaining its tree cover, the bottom half still being used by the Lewises for pasture. Classic example of what was going on throughout the rest of the state. Uplands having regained tree cover, bottom lowlands still being farmed. This is, you can see early days of the mountain road. This is the initial entrance. The inn is sort of over here. One of the gazebos, another of the gazebos. If you're familiar with the mountain road, then today's entrance is sort of over there. Here's the first hairpin curve, and then it heads up that way. You can see it heading up there. And here is another old shot. Here's the inn, Mount Philo Inn. And you can see the mountain road. Oh, but I forgot to show you. I remember that big old maple tree that was standing. There it is. That's it. And these young trees that were planted along the road, you can also see these on the mountain road, all in a straight line. So very cool, again, to stand there with this photo and match it with what's there now. So another early shot, again, trees on top, open on the bottom, Mount Philo Inn. The Humphreys, James and Frances, kept coming back summer after summer, and they were so enamored of the place that they eventually bought a little more land from Frank Lewis, and they built themselves a house where they spent 4 months out of every year. And unfortunately, in 1914, James died at the age of 64. I don't know what was his problem, but anyway, Frances now became the sole owner of the mountain. And so she was often asked, what do you plan to do with the mountain? What do you expect to get off Mount Philo is the question often asked me. What benefit is it to you? When do you expect to cut the wood off? This is now the trees that have grown back in. Not a stick of it, if I can help it. I just like to see the mountain changed. There is something in the world besides money, good as that may be. If the people of Vermont appreciate the privilege of riding up Mount Philo or walks through its paths, that is all that is asked by its owner. So I talked before about human decisions, accumulation of human decisions that result in a landscape. This is a major decision that Frances Humphreys made, not to cut a stick of it. And I would love, well, all right, I won't, okay. I love Frances Humphreys. So I mentioned that she was a poet, and just to give you a sense, again, the different kinds of evidence that enable us to really get the past. This is a poem she wrote soon after her husband died, and it gives you a sense of just what the mountain meant to her and James. And it's called Mount Philo Reverie. Alone on Philo's hillside fair, with sky so blue and air so rare, among the beeches and the pines, I sit and dream of olden times, of him who did so dearly love its sunny slopes, its lovely woods, and often to the summit climbed to get the view he called sublime. The paths were beautiful to him, and all the shelters he tarried in, the shelters being the gazebos. The road, the mountain road, he traveled o'er, and every time he praised it more. I sometimes wonder where he dwells, if he looks back on these lovely hills, and how we passed together here the hours which were to us so dear. So in 1924, Frances Humphreys made the ultimate statement of love about a place. She gave it to the state, forever to be held, owned, and used by the state of Vermont as and for a public park or public reservation for the health, recreation, and pleasure of the public. And these words make me think of words that were written about 50 years earlier in the Federal Organic Act of 1872 that established the first national park, Yellowstone National Park. This is the Roosevelt Arch leading into Yellowstone for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. So 50 years apart, but both stemming from the American conservation movement that was triggered by the severe deforestation that had happened throughout the area in the mid-19th century. Very often people will point to a book by George Perkins Marsh, Vermonter. He wrote a book called Man and Nature that came out in 1864, and it's cited as sort of the starting point of the American conservation movement. He wrote about the severe deforestation that had occurred throughout the Northeast and all of its effects on water quality, flood control, soil erosion, soil quality, landscape aesthetics. It was a time when people, because of how severe that deforestation was, people suddenly became aware of the fact that trees were important and that you couldn't just go around cutting them all down. It had severe results on the landscape and on people's ability to make a living from the landscape. So the conservation movement ultimately came out of that and resulted in things like national parks, state parks, forest preserves, public lands in general. This was a new idea, and really new to do it for the benefit of the people, for them to have recreation. And again, you know, that quote I wrote of Olmsted's about Central Park, very, very new idea to create a public park for the benefit of the people. So Francis Humphreys, in donating the land to the state of Vermont, again, teeny little small example of what was going on elsewhere. And her being from Boston and going up north and doing that is very, very typical of what was going on elsewhere. We have Percival Baxter, who came from Portland in Maine, bought up lots of acreage in northern Maine, which became Baxter State Park, where Mount Katahdin is. We have George Dorr, a very wealthy Bostonian, who he convinced his wealthy friends to buy up land in Acadia, well, what became Acadia National Park. And one of those wealthy friends was John D. Rockefeller Jr. John D. Rockefeller Jr. bought up tons of land out in Wyoming that then got added to Grand Teton National Park. So we have these wealthy urbanites who not only fell in love with the North, but they also were quite savvy about this new conservation movement, as I suspect Francis Humphreys was. And so her whole little purchase and donation of Mount Philo, again, once again, teeny little, perfect little gem of an example of what was going on throughout the region. So, okay, in 1924, the state now owns this mountain, and never before was the state given land for recreation. In 1909, the first state forest was created, but the point of state forests was to practice forestry. Forestry was a new science that stemmed out of this severe deforestation. They had to figure out, how do we harvest timber in a sustainable way? And that's what they were doing in state forests. But this was for recreation. So they had to create a new category. They called it a state forest park. And thus in 1924, Mount Philo became the first state park in Vermont. The state created this new entrance. This is today's entrance that severed the connection with the inn. They also planted trees. They could still practice forestry. It just wasn't ultimately for the harvest of the timber. They planted trees because they knew at that point that trees were necessary. So they planted all the bare places that had been pasture up until then. So this is a tree today. It's one of the trees that was planted in the 1920s by the state. This is a European larch. And right now the larches are becoming quite noticeable on the mountain. They're gorgeous little golden needles that form a carpet on the mountain road. And so this was one of the typical trees that the state was planting, not only on Mount Philo, but all over the state. They planted European larch, Scotch pine, jack pine, trees that were not native, but they had a good track record in Europe, where forestry had been practiced a lot longer than here in the States. So the state of Vermont decided, and actually all over the country, they decided to make use of the track record in Europe and plant foreign species. It makes it really easy today to know which are the plantations and which are the native trees that have grown in by themselves. But the main work done in the park in the 1930s was done by the Civilian Conservation Corps, a federal program putting young unemployed men to work during the Great Depression. And the CCC, there were 40,000 CCC guys working in the state of Vermont during the 30s, many of them working on Vermont state parks, as they were also working in state parks and national parks throughout the country. So again, Mount Philo being a microcosm of what was going on elsewhere. They worked under the auspices of the National Park Service and the Vermont Forest Service. So the cool thing about that is that the design guidelines that they were working under for park infrastructure were the same design guidelines that were being used in the national parks. So think about park infrastructure in any national park, not any, but most of the national parks. You think of those lovely lodges and they're really gorgeous stuff. The design guidelines said that the infrastructure, the architecture, the landscaping should take second place to the natural landscape. It should take its cues from the natural landscape. Simple materials, rustic in design, more horizontal than vertical. So these design guidelines, though small, very humble, the Ranger House does adhere to those guidelines. Painted a dark brown to fade into the background, making use of rustic detail. It's not interfering with any view. It's kind of taking a back seat to why you've really come to the park. Just as the lodge up near the summit, it's taking a back seat. This lovely half-round siding to make it look like a log cabin, rustic and more horizontal. So these are all going under National Park Service guidelines. So you can think of them as sort of poor cousins to the lodges, you know, the sort of grander lodges that you think of, more rustic details. The CCC style, or sometimes it's called parkitecture or NPS style. Craig Whipple, the head of the Division of Vermont State Parks, has called it the brand of Vermont State Parks. So again, another indication that what has gone on Mount Philo is indicative of what's gone on throughout the state. And so even more modern buildings, this is a bathroom building that was built near the summit just several years ago, built in parkitecture style. The CCC put in the first power line to give electric power to the two buildings up at the top. This is a footing near the summit to hold one of the power line poles, and it doesn't get more rustic than that, using native materials. They also built 12 stone fireplaces in conjunction with picnic areas, and this again using the Moncton quartzite that is on the mountain. This is one of the treasure hunts in the guidebook. There are 3 very obvious stone fireplaces up at the summit, but there are 9 that are hidden away in the woods that used to be picnic areas but have become overgrown. So I leave it up to you to find the 9. And it's kind of like coming across ancient ruins. And again, a place to stand, let your imagination take away the trees, get back in time, and imagine what it was like in the 1930s when this whole part of the park that now nobody goes to used to be a very popular picnic area. And also to harken back to a day when the government actually created things like the CCC and took care of parks. Road, upper parking lot, and right here, it's kind of hard to see, that's a fire tower that the CCC built in the mid-30s. The standard, what you think of as a fire tower, the steel thing with the glass cab up at top. And there is evidence of that in the park, the sort of concrete footings for the fire tower. It was taken down in the 70s, I think for safety reasons. So I'm going to wind up by talking about the park today. This is a current park map and how it is a kind of a layering of the original work done in 1901, layered over with the 1930s work. So we have the original entrance to the road came about over here, joined up with today's road. Here's the up road. So this all follows pretty much the original Carriage Road path from 1901. And then at the summit, it doesn't show it on the map, but there are the various outlooks that Frank Lewis established. So the up road and the outlooks that we know and use today they all date back to 1901. The 1930s work, the newer entrance that we use today, the down road, the campsite was established in the 30s. and the two buildings, the power line. Yeah, so those two time periods pretty much created the park that we know today. And so my ultimate goal in giving these talks and writing the guidebook is to enable visitors to the park to stand in any place and to think about why does this place look the way it does, and why is Mount Philo what it is today, a park, publicly owned, forested, to sort of peel away the layers and to think about that the abuse and the atonement that was in the Sam Bassett quote, and the human decisions that went into creating what we know today, all right? So you stand here, why is there the road? What were all the decisions that led up to that? And really, you have to go all the way back to the sheep farming, the abuse, and then ultimately what people decided to do to atone for that abuse. Because the tourism sprung up as a result of no longer being able to sheep farm, and one of the reasons for no longer being able to sheep farm was that the soil had eroded so much that you couldn't even maintain sheep farming anymore. So anyway, so we've got the road, concrete block, that harkens back to the early days of Vermont tourism. Why are there trees? And why are there some Norway spruce and some native trees? So all of the little aspects of history that we've gone through, all of the decisions that resulted in this. And so, and knowing, yeah, so remember this is that same spot there. You know, what happened to bring the trees back? They really didn't just grow in by themselves. They were planted, Norway spruce, and there was a decision to allow the trees to grow back in. They didn't necessarily have to stay there, you know. So my ultimate goal is to have people be able to figure out all the things that went into creating not just Mount Philo, but creating Vermont, the Vermont landscape that we know. And also, ultimately, I find that what I've learned from my research, I apply whenever I go to any park now, or just forested lands. Why is Vermont now almost 75% forested? To understand all the human decisions that went into that, to realize that generosity, love of land, those are the kinds of decisions that create this kind of place. And this becomes increasingly important these days with public lands, the Vermont landscape, increasingly under siege. There was a VPR, or either maybe NPR show about a year ago that talked about the fact that New England is now, for the first time since the middle of the 19th century, at the height of deforestation, New England is now, for the first time since then, losing forested land because of development. So are we going to go back? Do we have to relearn those lessons? I mean, so there's a lot to learn from what ultimately resulted in Mount Philo, the kinds of decisions that we have to make in order to preserve places and to continue to enable them to thrive. So I'm going to end there. I'm just going to, there are my thanks, and I'm happy to take questions. And yeah.
Do you know how Mount Philo got its name?
Yeah, I do. Well, actually, the answer to that question is no. And everybody, there's always somebody who asks that question, so I'm prepared. So the ultimate answer is nobody really knows. But there are lovely theories, some of which contradict each other. And so the one that I place most faith in is the one, this is from, there's a book by Esther Swift called Vermont Place Names. And apparently, she thinks that it was named during a burst of enthusiasm for names with a classical flavor. You know, it goes along, the architecture during that time period was also hearkening back to the classical, you know, Roman and Greek revival stuff. It was a little fad, maybe. But there are lots of other,
Why was it North Ferrisburgh? When did the town line?
so yeah, you noticed that on the brochure. Yeah, on the brochure it says North Ferrisburgh. The town line never changed. It was a postal address. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah. Yeah.
Was the Carriage Road, when it was first built, a toll road? Or did you have to stay at the end?
So that's a good question. It was free, but so in the back of the guidebook there are a couple of old magazine articles written at the time that the Carriage Road was in use, and in one of them it talks about the fact that maintaining the Carriage Road cost money, and it was suggested that they charge a toll. And James Humphreys said, maybe 99 out of 100 people can afford that toll, but my concern is with that one person who can't afford it. So he footed the bill for maintaining the road. Yet another example of I mean, these people were great. At least that's my version of them, who knows, but yeah, very generous. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you say something about what was happening in the actual village of North Ferrisburgh, which people who are just traveling along Route 7, you're seeing a little bit of exurbia with a gas station.
Mm-hmm.
But if you head east, you go down into a little hollow,
Right.
and there's some beautiful old houses. There's a beautiful, I would say, 19th century, early 19th century settlement there.
Yeah, that's where I live. Yeah, so there is this lovely village.
Which you don't want anyone else to know.
Which I don't want anybody else to know. The thing that's cool about it is it's very authentic. It's nothing's been sort of, I mean, we take good care of our homes, but I think it's a very authentic little village, and there used to be all kinds of Lewis Creek runs through it, and there used to be all kinds of old mills. There was an old library, an old IGA. I mean, yeah, so
There was an
yeah.
IGA there.
Yes,
Do you
yeah.
know when the IGA closed?
Oh boy, that probably was in the 60s or 70s.
So there were a bunch of people living there really until the 60s, enough to support.
Oh, we still live there. Yes. Right now, the IGA is turning into a piano repair shop. So,
How is there a North Ferrisburgh school?
no.
So the juvenile population dwindled.
Yes,
At some
yeah.
point.
There had been a one-room schoolhouse. Yeah, and so North, excuse me, it's part of North Ferrisburgh, which really is part of Ferrisburgh. Yeah. I could talk to you more about that. Any more questions? Yeah.
I do have a question, and you probably write about it in the guidebook, but I'm not there yet in my reading. I remember the first time I experienced Mount Philo, I felt offended by having blacktop.
Oh, yes.
So was there a real battle about that?
So the first time they paved it was in 1940s, in the early 1940s, and they did it only on the very steep parts to prevent erosion. I don't know when the whole thing was blacktopped. And that kind of sort of ties in. I've been asked at other presentations, why cars? Why did they encourage cars? And the whole thinking in the 1930s, in the whole early days of the national parks, there's a quote that I think might be in the guidebook from Stephen Mather, the first head of the National Park Service, about how the best decision they made in terms of the national parks was allowing cars. It was seen back then as a democratic thing. It was a leveling thing. You could come and first of all, they wanted to increase visitorship. We didn't have, right now we think of national parks as bursting at the seams, and how do we stop people from, how do we beat them back? Back then, when national parks were first started, when any park was first started, they wanted to encourage people to visit. And cars were the way to do it. And it was a leveling thing. It was, there was a thing in the 30s of they wanted to create a skyline drive sort of thing across the Green Mountains in the 1930s. And believe it or not, that was a progressive point of view to enable more people to come, and the conservative point of view was, no, we don't want those people coming to the Green Mountains. Those people being the people who were enjoying Central Park because they couldn't afford, So it's like a completely different mindset. Now, that's the historic thing. Whether or not cars belong on Mount Philo now, that's another question. But yeah, Larry.
It's funny because that does give it an accessibility, but now that's important to us again. In things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, we want to have that kind of accessibility, and Mount Philo does.
It does. It does. In fact, one of my fondest memories, late memories of my dad. My dad is who first got me hiking mountains in Vermont, and he then got to a point, he had strokes and he couldn't hike, but we were able to drive to the summit of Mount Philo, park, and walk to the outlook. I may start crying now, but he turned to me at one point, he said, "I never thought I'd be able to do this again." So for him, that was enough. So yeah, if you want to hike a mountain for wilderness, don't go to Mount Philo, that's for sure. Although there are parts, that base of cliff trail, man, that's about as, I've seen people break ankles and things on that trail. So you can have some, but yeah. Right, okay, so, thank you.